Well, it's just simply so hard to not focus on 9/11 and the aftermath as being the centerpiece of his presidency. I'm, and I'm confident that that was not something he aspired to be a priority. I think he knew that national security would be important, but quite honestly, when you really think about coming in January of '01 when he did, it was that moment when we had this kind of post-Cold War sigh of relief, and there was actually expectation that foreign policy and national security matters might actually become less of a predominant obsession as they had been, throughout the Cold War. His, I will tell you, I think what he's been, he launched the Medicare Part D in the United States, which, when you ponder the fact that before him, our elderly had no coverage for pharmaceuticals, it was an extraordinary dilemma. And it was a dilemma for precisely the types of people that President Trump ultimately talked about, the forgotten man and woman, meaning the United States, and I think this is true in a lot of in many developed countries. We're not alone in this, but if you're exceptionally well off in the United States, you're going to do great. You can make a lot of money in the United States, and you'll have very little issues or problems. And simultaneously, but less mentioned, if you're incredibly poor, you have no income, you have no assets, it's also an incredibly generous country. I mean, housing, food, all basic healthcare, all these needs are taken care of, despite what you might hear about the suffering of the poor. The poor that suffer the most are those that are, kind of above the poverty level, who do have income or do have some assets, but aren't making a lot of money. So when you consider that population was having to, and Medicare beneficiaries in the United States include those usually over the age of 65 or those with permanent or fairly permanent disabilities, having to pay for drug expenses. It was bankrupting people, and even then they weren't really finding a way to get it paid for until they were eligible for Medicaid. So it made no sense. And I know there was criticism that it was a big government initiative contrary to conservative sentiment, but I really heard a little, just like I'm hearing very little now on the Obamacare replacement. We seem sometimes to be better at criticizing the other side than coming up with our own innovative ideas, and we're still running on some ideas, frankly, from the 80s that
Right.
have just become a little time worn. Then let me just on 9/11 look. So he's in the office for a while. The intelligence, even in the 9/11 Commission report, the FBI says all the sirens are all going off, the lights are red. There were people that were really in our intel and in our even our domestic FBI really pounding the table on the danger of Al-Qaeda and how they had taken up safe harbor under the Taliban in Afghanistan and represented a real and present danger. And I have to say, that to be objective about it, and we need more objectivity, I think, in our assessment of these things, not just blind loyalty.
Right.
That message didn't get to him, and it wasn't acted on. And even additionally, as you probably know, following Afghanistan and being closer to it geographically, Ahmad Shah Massoud, who I was a very strong supporter of, I think he's, in having dealt with foreign affairs in a really broad ranging area, and in a fairly reasonably high level with getting to know some heads of state and things like that. he was an incredibly gifted leader who, for being in a war setting, the most difficult circumstances in this mountainous, somewhat challenging terrain,
Right.
you know, he really led, and not just in a military way. He had political and people leadership skills. And he always said, as you probably have heard, that the United States and the West will have something to worry about if something ever happens to me. And I always found that a little unusual. He said it in Europe. I believe he said it in the US. It was a common line that he used in his public addresses. And I can't think of anything that proved more prophetic, because I can remember September 9, to 48 hours before 9/11, he's killed by Al-Qaeda operatives posing as journalists in Panjshir Valley, and he sure proved right about that. But even then, you did not see in those 48 hours leading up to 9/11 any significant escalation in our security measures. Then, to his credit, this is Bush's greatest moment. He was asked this recently, and what's his greatest moment? His greatest moment, in my view, it's almost beyond dispute. I mean, he's at ground zero. It's a couple of weeks past 9/11. The country went through a range of emotions. People responded to it, 9/11, very differently. Some were, people cried, people were angry, people were disengaged. Everyone responds to something like that differently. Then there was this bonding process, as you probably have heard about, where the country really came together. But then, it was kind of like, all right, well, what are we going to do? Like, people really were getting around to let's take it to him. And he's up there and spontaneously addresses in that famous bullhorn speech that when the firefighters and the rescue personnel can't hear what he's saying through the bullhorn, I hear you, and the rest of the world will hear you, and the people who tore down these buildings will hear from all of us very soon. And I think then that leadership followed up by a very ultimately quickly successful removal of the Taliban from power, and then what was a pretty quick isolation and decimation of Al-Qaeda minus bin Laden, who was on the run and clearly, in my view, was being harbored by Pakistan and had been for a long time. His ability to execute that was great. And then Iraq, another big intel miscalculation that is mind-boggling to this date. These are not the sort of things that the United States of America should get wrong. And the only thing I can say in fairness is, remember that the UN had supported this. They by and large ultimately came to share the concerns that we had. The intel that we did have was broadly shared, and it was a bipartisan undertaking. Joe Biden, for instance, has no criticism. He voted to authorize the use of force in Iraq and was one of the biggest proponents of it. But I have to think, in retrospect, if we went back to March of 2003 and you had asked me, is the world better off leaving Saddam Hussein, bad as tyrannical as he was, in power, or should we, take 3,000 young American lives, destabilize this complicated, diverse, large country, empower Iran and the Iranian regime in the process, give rise to ISIS, which frankly it did, and then get ourselves bogged down in a nearly two decade conflict? Obviously, in my view, the answer is absolutely not. And yet I have to say, in the United States, partly because politics has become such a partisan undertaking, we can't just speak objectively. The people make good decisions and bad decisions. We're humans. But I think that's one of the single or worst decisions ever made. And then ultimately, the thing that's most bothersome to me is Donald Trump, when he did come along, is clearly a little different, cut from a different piece of cloth. I mean, maybe a little more like Bush was before the age of 40, a little more rough-edged, but the issues that he brought to the surface were really important, and I do not think it was constructive, and certainly is not now constructive, for him to be as disparaging as he's been, because we don't get these issues right. Trade, immigration, China, those are the three big ones, which frankly, he didn't do much about, Obama didn't do much about. I mean, no modern president has done much about. This country's in grave danger. So I think that's also been an error and a miscalculation. And we're redefining this party, really. I mean, it's kind of, and I've kind of had a foot. I'm one of those few people who's had a foot in both the Bush era and very heavily in the Trump era, who I endorsed on day one.
Right.
Please remember to subscribe to us and switch on the notifications for this channel. For our other social media links, more content, and to support our work, please visit citti.net. Dhanyavad. Namaskar.